If you've always been a die-hard Harry Potter fan, your relationship to this franchise is very different from mine. You very likely won't relate at all to what I'm about to say, but Hogwarts Legacy is probably the biggest surprise I've had in terms of gaming in a long time. This game was probably the best thing that's ever happened to the Harry Potter franchise or the Wizarding World franchise in years. Even people who know nothing about gaming know that this is the game that sold more than 20 million copies in less than a month, or that this is the game that made more than $1 billion in less than a month. This game tried to be what Knights of the Old Republic used to be for Star Wars. It's like the Cyberpunk 2077 for Mike Pondsmith's Dark Future universe, or the Bloodlines for Vampire the Masquerade and most of the World of Darkness universe. It's a game you can tell was made for lifelong fans, a game the writers and the developers took painstaking efforts to make as authentic and as true to the original source material as they could. Most people who've always loved this franchise completely rallied behind it, but at the same time, it was also something that very likely brought in lots of new fans that either didn't grow up with this 26-year-old franchise, or who just never really gave it a chance before they played this game. And on top of that, given that Harry Potter is more than 20 years old by this point, I can guarantee Legacy also brought back fans who had all but abandoned the franchise years ago. Let me just use myself as an example. I'm not gonna lie, back when it came out, I pretty much thought there was no way it would actually be any good. First off, I'll completely admit the only other times I ever played Harry Potter video games might have even been back before a few of you were born, but I still remember the games I played, and to me personally, something about those games just always made them feel so dreary and so lackluster and dull. They just got really dry and really tedious the longer you sat there and played them. I just never enjoyed playing any of those games. And second of all, I used to like Harry Potter a really long time ago. As a kid, I read every one of the books and I watched all of the first 5 movies. But at the same time, for me personally, this whole franchise also really just lost a lot of its appeal before it actually ended. The last time I was even remotely interested in anything Harry Potter related was apparently all the way back in 2007, when Order of the Phoenix was just released and when Deathly Hallows was just published. By that point, I had mostly just lost interest in it. And I want to say this was just when a lot of us had just outgrown it, when we were all just getting older and moving on to other things, but if I'm being really honest, I remember even before this, by the time I got to the second last book, this whole franchise was just starting to feel tedious and tired. For me, it just stopped being interesting. And after that, for 17 years, I don't think I ever really thought about Harry Potter again until I started hearing about Hogwarts Legacy. But then recently, a very good friend of mine who's been in love with Harry Potter since she was a kid finally convinced me to try Hogwarts Legacy, and you know what? I was completely wrong about it. It's been almost 2 years since it actually came out, but I've been having an absolute blast playing this game. If you like single-player, story-driven games, then Legacy is a very good game. The gameplay is actually fluid and exciting, and the open world is almost everything you could hope for in a franchise like this. And in terms of the writing, the characters you meet, and all the different storylines that play out in this game are as compelling and three-dimensional as anything you saw in the books or in the movies. But what Legacy probably does best is that it really captures and shows you the best parts of this whole franchise again. Playing this game really draws you more and more into the setting and really makes it interesting again. The most surprising thing about all this is that Legacy got me so interested in the whole Wizarding world again that this same friend even actually got me to revisit the rest of the franchise. It's been something like 17 years, but because of this one game, I actually went and watched the movies again. I finally saw those last 3 movies 17 years later. I even went and finally watched those new Fantastic Beast movies. And because I liked this game, I even let her talk me into trying a very different game. A kind of game I'd normally never touch just for my own sanity. But you know what? Legacy actually got me so invested in this setting and this universe that now I have a full love-hate obsession with it and legitimately can't stop playing it. And I'll bring that up again later for a comparison, but the point is Legacy actually did give me this whole new interest in this franchise again. And if you just look back at the sky-high sales and then the massive surge in Harry Potter content we were seeing like it was 2004 again, or just the massive waves of support the game was getting all around from original fans when it came out, I'm clearly not the only one. All in all, Legacy is clearly one of the biggest things in the entire Wizarding franchise as of right now, and it's been an absolute boon for a franchise that had largely lost a lot of its popularity. But whenever you have a long-standing franchise with a ton of pre-existing lore and source material, there's always going to be a ton of debate among fans about whether or not a game like Hogwarts Legacy should be accepted as a legitimate part of the franchise. Whenever you have an adaptation that's set years and years away from the main events of the mainline franchise, and that was licensed and made by different people, this always kicks off a lot of debates about what's really canon and what's not canon. There's a lot of debate over whether or not Legacy should officially be considered a part of the overall continuity alongside the books and the newer movies, or whether it's just a side adaptation made by other people that doesn't really count as real Harry Potter. No matter what it's done for the franchise, all the success in the world won't change the fact that while some people absolutely love it, others see it as glorified fan fiction and will never accept it as part of the franchise, even if J.K. Rowling herself were to come out and tell them it's canon. Canon in almost any series or any franchise gets very contentious because of how unclear or just how convoluted it can be. On top of that, it can kind of be a touchy subject, because on top of what's officially labeled canon, people who've been following the franchise for a long time have their own personal ideas and takes on what's canon. Personally, I try not to pay too much attention to whether something like Legacy is canon, because really it doesn't matter if something you already like is canon or not. Not having it recognized as an official part of the franchise doesn't somehow make it less enjoyable. But at the same time, if you're a fan of these sorts of things, then you can't help but find these sorts of debates a little interesting. And at the same time, you can't really help but form your own perspectives on things. When it comes to Hogwarts Legacy, the question of whether it's canon is pretty simple, at least as of right now. But beyond that, there are also a lot of different debates about whether or not Hogwarts Legacy should be canon. And when it comes to that, then there are a few arguments I would make and a few things I think should be considered overall. First of all, let's just make it clear what I mean by canon, because canon does mean something specific, but that meaning is so open-ended it can actually apply to two completely different things. Generally speaking, when you're talking about anything that involves storytelling and writing, canon refers to anything that's accepted as a valid part of a larger body of works. Firstly, it's a way of separating what's official and what isn't, like one of the mainline books in a franchise versus some nonsense fan fiction someone like me could randomly write and publish all by themselves. It's a distinction between what's acknowledged and what's recognized as part of a specific body of works versus something that isn't. But when most people talk about canon nowadays, they're mainly talking about stories that are all supposed to connect to each other within the stories themselves. They're talking about stories that have an overall continuity with each other in the actual events of the stories, that are all supposed to be considered a part of one shared fictional universe. So canon in this context is anything that's considered a valid part of the overall continuity that's supposed to be maintained throughout a bunch of different stories in a series. A story is canon if it's supposed to be connected and related to the other recognized stories in that series, if it ties into them, or if it's accepted that it takes place in the same fictional setting. And it's not just entire books or movies or video games. Even just some very specific detail or idea that's only mentioned in a specific story can be canon if it's something that's accepted and true throughout the rest of the other stories. And if it's canon, then going forward, other stories that are also canon can reference it or show it or use it as part of a larger plotline, because it's supposed to be accepted that all these things are part of the same shared fictional universe. But nowadays, one of the things that tends to happen is that a creator will end up selling off or licensing their material to other people, or just hiring other people to create stories that are all supposed to be canon and continuous with the original. The original creator or the owner of this material officially recognizes these new stories and officially considers them part of the overall franchise. So even though some of this stuff wasn't written by the original creator, it's still recognized as part of the same continuity and the same body of works, and it's still considered canon. In fact, this is so common nowadays that most, or at least a lot of people, use the word canon just to refer to continuity and nothing more. But there's obviously another way for stories and for writing to be related to each other. Multiple stories can be written by the same writer, and they're all considered a part of that writer's body of works, even if the stories themselves have nothing to do with one another. In this context, people also use the word canon just to say these all come from the same writer. This is especially common if you look at classic literature. Having a long-running series or a franchise was pretty much unheard of a long time ago. Edgar Allan Poe wrote tons of poems and tons of short stories, but the majority of these have no connection to each other except that he wrote them. And when people talk about prolific writers like this, all these stories are a part of their canon because we know these were written by them. So overall, canon just describes stories that all fit in one collection. But because this can happen two very different ways, this is where you get a lot of ambiguity. If you Google the definition of canon, then in this context, it's supposed to mean the books that are accepted as a genuine part of a collection of religious texts, or what's considered the genuine works of a particular author or creator. On the other hand, sources like Merriam-Webster accept a broader definition that means a sanctioned or accepted group or body of related works. Either way, you're describing stories that all fit into one collection. It's the same underlying idea, but those two very different scenarios are why what's canon and what's not canon can get really, really messy. Because not all creators have the exact same ideas about what's canon, but on top of that, some people will always insist that something can only be canon if it was written by the original creator. They look at franchises the same way they look at writing from a single person like Shakespeare or Chaucer, and they'd insist that anything written by anyone else can't be considered canon no matter what. Even when the owner of the franchise recognizes someone else's work as canon, these people still insist that it isn't canon. Now, if you ask me at least, there is actually an objective way to look at all this. And don't get me wrong, I say objective, but anyone who watches this might argue I'm getting it wrong, or that it's just a matter of opinion, and that's perfectly fine. This is just me saying this is just my overview and what I see when it comes to this sort of debate about canon and not canon. So if you think I got it wrong, go ahead and tell me down in the comments. But if you ask me, even if some people don't personally accept it, there is actually an objectively factual and correct way to make sense of all this. Because really, that very hard line, very one-sided take on what's canon and what's not is really just very short-sighted and superficial if you stop and think about it. And really, the reasoning behind it is completely off base and incorrect. Let's just use these two definitions here as examples. Really, nothing's actually saying these two things have to be mutually exclusive from each other, because a definition like this is very clearly situational. It doesn't say the works created by one particular author. It says the works of a particular author that are recognized as genuine, meaning this only applies if you're comparing works by one particular author. But it doesn't actually say anything about situations where multiple people contributed to one body of work. This only means in a situation where we're discussing what was actually written by one specific person and what wasn't, these would be the only works we know for sure were written by them, but that anything else would just be questionable. But outside that kind of comparison, there's really nothing here or anywhere else that actually says another creator can't decide that someone else can contribute to their work. Because first off, someone like Chaucer was only ever involved with his own works, so the only canon that exists there is what he wrote. But there's obviously a difference between a writer who only ever published their own work and then a writer who went on to include other people in their projects. There are plenty of examples of writers and creators doing this. Tolkien is one of the most famous writers of all time, but before he died, he legally named his son Christopher as his literary executor and willed him the full power to publish, edit, alter, rewrite, or complete any of his works that were still unpublished. And you know what? His son was helping him edit and write his original books for years, and Tolkien himself considered whatever he wanted to do with the rest of his material canon. So first off, arguing against this and saying this isn't canon is just saying that a creator doesn't have the right to decide for themselves what's a part of their own creation. It's basically a way of ignoring what the owner of the franchise recognizes as a part of their franchise. And a lot of writers go even further than Tolkien did. Writers have openly collaborated with other writers and had them write parts of their books. Some have even invited people they know to write whole chapters or even entire segments of their books. So really, these books weren't just written by them, because not only was there technically someone else involved, but someone else actually influenced all this person's writing for the rest of the entire book. Their writing is actually building off of or using someone else's writing all throughout that one book. But they still consider books like this canon, and these are still included as part of their works. And a lot of these writers even reference this material in the rest of their later books. And if they can do all that, then really, what reasonable argument can anyone make that another creator couldn't officially hire someone else to write a new installment in their franchise using all their original material? Sure, it would be a different writer with a different writing style, but quality isn't the question here. Either way, the person who actually owns this material is still on board and fully embraces this. They're officially recognizing it, and it was written as a part of their material with their permission. But more importantly, the reason why the idea this can't be canon is really just ridiculous is that there's actually no real reason for it. Just saying we shouldn't accept it because they didn't write it themselves is really just arbitrary, subjective reasoning. Because this idea the definition of canon only means what was written by the original creator is just completely incorrect. Remember, canon even applies to religious texts, but in pretty much every religion, most of the different texts were written by lots of different people and at lots of different points in time. In some religions, there are even debates among religious scholars about whether certain things or certain texts should be considered canon. But you know what? No one ever questions the fact that these things were written by different people. All these different books still pertain to the same thing, and they're all still recognized as canon by their respective religious authorities. And then on top of that, movies, comics, video games, and TV shows also have their own canon behind them. But most of these franchises never keep the same roster of writers from project to project. Movies have multiple screenwriters that change with every sequel. Game studios hire different writers and developers all the time. TV shows have different people writing pretty much every single episode. Sure, there's usually a main writer or someone leading the project, but it's clearly not all their material, and sometimes even that person gets swapped out for someone else. And with comic franchises like Marvel or DC, there are countless different characters and stories written by hundreds of different people that are all considered canon to each other. So saying that canon just means things that was written by a specific original creator is clearly wrong. If that's all that canon was, then the whole idea would completely lose a lot of its more important meaning. And sure, some people could try and argue some of those things are exceptions because those circumstances are different, but if you have to make a bunch of different exceptions to try and push a definition, there's clearly something wrong with that definition, especially when there's a larger and more accurate definition that's already accepted by a lot, if not the majority of people. Really, all you can objectively say is that canon is just whatever's accepted as a valid part of a larger body of works. And really, whoever owns that body of work is the only one who can actually say for sure what's valid and what's not. Even if that person isn't around anymore, whatever they accepted as an official part of their work, or whatever the current owner of the material accepts is what's official. If the creator or owner says something is canon, then it's canon. And if they say it isn't canon, then it's not canon. Canon overall just means it's acknowledged and it's recognized as an official part of that collection of stories and material. The only time there's really ever any ambiguity is when it's not exactly clear what the official position really is. Now, for franchises like the ones I mentioned earlier, what's canon and what's not is pretty straightforward. There's one undisputed authority on what's canon, and everything in the franchise is all pretty closely tied together. But with the Wizarding franchise, canon gets a little convoluted because you have the main books and a bunch of other material written by J.K. Rowling, and then you have a metric ton of adaptations and other materials that are all based on her books and all her other writing. Now, with Harry Potter, most of the video games and all the different movies are all actually just direct adaptations of the original 7 books or of other things written by Rowling. You'd think adaptations that are mostly supposed to be the same exact story with a few changes would hardly warrant discussions on what's canon, yet because these things are all officially licensed, but they feature things like certain spells or certain conversations that weren't in the original books, there are actually arguments on what's canon and what's not. Because of this, there's kind of a system sort of like what they used to have in Star Wars. There's apparently a whole system of designating different levels of what's canon, where basically whatever Rowling wrote or writes in the future supersedes anything else that directly contradicts it, but at the same time, anything else that's introduced that isn't directly contradicted by Rowling anywhere else is basically considered fair game and is basically theoretically canon until Rowling says otherwise. Like, the video games and the movies that are directly adapting the events of the books change some of those events, so those specific changes aren't canon to the rest of the franchise. But something like the Flipendo spell, which was invented by the video games, isn't actually contradicted anywhere in the books, so unless Rowling herself explicitly disavows it later, then in theory, it could be canon. But here's the thing. What makes this different from Star Wars is that none of this has ever actually been an official system. If you look this up, all of this has only been what fans have started assuming because J.K. Rowling herself hasn't actually said anything about this one way or another. If you look this up, it says Rowling's actually been toying with the idea of writing some sort of encyclopedia where she directly confirms what's canon and what's not in the entire Harry Potter universe. But as of now, she's never actually done this, and she herself has never actually laid out any rules for franchise canon. So on the one hand, people might be right to assume that everything we see like Hogwarts Legacy or the different spells they added in movies or in games is just an additional form of canon. But at the same time, there have never been any company officials saying any of the adapted material is canon like there were for Star Wars. And J.K. Rowling herself has never actually said how people should look at what's canon. So really, there aren't any official positions on this one way or the other. And we can't really say for sure if that sort of stuff is supposed to be canon or not. A lot of people are already convinced Hogwarts Legacy is canon, and a lot of people are already convinced it can never be canon. A lot of people already insist that Legacy is just a video game made by Warner Brothers and that it's not a genuine part of the franchise. But really, when it comes to whether or not Hogwarts Legacy is canon, the fact is that no one actually knows. As of right now, nothing anyone says either way is anything more than speculation. Because again, J.K. Rowling has never actually established a real position on what's canon when it comes to these adaptations. In the future, Legacy could very easily be canon, but it could just as easily not be canon. But until Rowling or someone who can actually speak for the franchise comes out and says that it's canon or that it's not canon, no one actually knows for sure if Legacy is supposed to be canon or not. There's a chance not even Rowling knows herself, because she might not have even made up her mind yet, or she might not have given it any real thought and decided what she wants to do with it yet. Now, if you were asking me whether I think Hogwarts Legacy is canon, or rather if I think it's going to be canon, then if I'm being honest, I personally suspect that it's not. Personally, I have doubts about whether Legacy would ever really be officially recognized as canon, and the reason why is that if you look up J.K. Rowling, it says that she's almost 60 years old. Now, don't get me wrong here, we've probably all heard about Skyrim Grandma. Obviously not everyone is the same, but most of the time, people who don't play video games themselves tend to see them very differently than people who do, especially if they didn't grow up with them, and especially if they're a lot older and it's something new and strange to them. People like this tend to be very prejudiced and very narrow-minded towards the whole idea of gaming. They tend to see video games as a lesser art form, as something mindless, as a complete waste of time, as something that's almost sinfully indulgent even. Never mind the fact that most of these people have wasted years and years of their lives sitting in front of the television every day to entertain themselves, and that these same exact complaints can and have been made about watching TV or watching movies, or hell about things like reading fantasy novels. But because gaming hasn't been normalized to them, this is the way most people like this will choose to see things. It's just this very ingrained, very small-minded, very pretentious way of looking at things that most people tend to have about pretty much anything they don't personally enjoy, anything they don't personally see value in. So really, I'd be pretty surprised if a nearly 60-year-old woman like J.K. Rowling would ever actually be willing to acknowledge that a video game like Hogwarts Legacy is canon to the books and the screenplays that are basically her entire legacy in life. If I'm being really honest, I just have a hard time seeing that happening. But on the other hand, I could easily be wrong. Because like I mentioned earlier, Legacy is an astonishing success, and it's something that actually does mean a lot to tons of people. So that and the fact that the whole wizarding world is her life's legacy might actually give her an incentive to recognize Legacy as canon. And really, there's nothing actually stopping her from doing it. If J.K. Rowling decided that Hogwarts Legacy is canon, nothing as of right now would actually stand in the way of that if you really think about it. Hogwarts Legacy is supposed to be set in 1890. Its story is supposed to take place almost 40 years before Fantastic Beasts and more than 100 years before the mainline Harry Potter books. The game's entire narrative was written and designed specifically so it could fit in with the rest of the franchise's timeline, so that everything that happens in it could be continuous with the rest of the Wizarding franchise. And overall, nothing in this game really contradicts or goes against the mainline canon. Sure, if you looked hard enough, you might find some very minor inconsistency most people never noticed, something that very likely doesn't actually affect the plot or the main ideas behind the franchise. But almost every single franchise you can think of has these kinds of inconsistencies. Even the books and the screenplays Rowling wrote herself have inconsistencies with each other. That doesn't necessarily destroy canon, because the events and the main ideas of the story itself are still consistent with the rest of the franchise. And it's also worth noting, there's a chance Rowling had more to do with this game than we actually know. The developers insisted she had nothing to do with making this game, that they made it themselves with full respect to all her writing and all her material, but that she wasn't involved. But for all we know, this might not even really be true. J.K. Rowling's become very controversial, to say the least, and given everything that happened while this game was in development and when it came out, for all we know, this might have all just been a cover story. Or it might not have been the entire truth. She might not have been telling them what to do with it, and she might not have written the game, but she still might very well have been a part of it being made. But really though, even if she wasn't, that wouldn't actually even matter. Because really, if Rowling just decided tomorrow she liked the game, then she could decide tomorrow that it's canon. Even if one of her kids just decided that they liked it and introduced it to her, she could just go on Twitter or her website or wherever and just publish a statement saying Legacy is canon if she wanted. And no matter how much some people might not like that or might not want it to be canon, the rest of the franchise going forward would still treat it as canon. Not only would nothing in the source material actually disprove this, but like I said earlier, it also wouldn't be the first time creators have done this. If someone like Tolkien can recognize someone else's work as part of his creation after he died, then there's no reason Rowling couldn't recognize something made by Warner Brothers as a part of her franchise. And if franchises like these can branch out into comic books or anime or video games that the creators themselves consider a part of the mainline story, then there's no reason Rowling couldn't do the same with Hogwarts Legacy. But with all that out of the way, there's obviously still another side to all this, and that's that there's a very big difference between whether something is canon and whether something should be canon. And really, this is where most of the debates and most of the back and forths actually come from whenever there's any kind of talk about canon. Because even if the original creator tells us something's canon or something isn't canon, there's still going to be a lot of different opinions about whether or not it deserves to be canon. There's still going to be a lot of different opinions about whether or not it actually measures up to the source material. And overall, whenever you have something like Hogwarts Legacy that really stands out from the rest of the franchise, there's always going to be people who absolutely love it, and then people who think it's too different and who will personally never accept it as part of the franchise, even if it's declared canon. With Legacy, we can't really say for sure right now if it's supposed to be canon or not. But like I said earlier, some people already think it's the best thing ever, while other people already think it's glorified fan fiction and will outright never accept it having any real ties to the books, even if Rowling herself tells them that it's canon. No matter what's officially canon or not, for some people, this is always just going to be a matter of opinion. So with all that said, when it comes to whether Hogwarts Legacy should be canon, I personally think that it should. This whole part of the video is definitely just my opinion, this is just what I think, but personally, I would argue there are a lot of reasons why Hogwarts Legacy should be made canon to the rest of the franchise. First of all, everything I brought up about Legacy at the start of the video definitely shows just how monumental it is to the franchise overall. This game sold so many copies that it made more than $1 billion in just a month. Some argue a lot of people bought this game out of spite, that all the back and forth around this game started a resistance to the whole boycott and that this was what was driving a lot of those sales. But even if that's true, most of those people who bought this game will still be around to support it when it comes time to make a sequel. Most of these people are still there and they're already invested in Hogwarts Legacy overall. But more importantly, most of these people were already at least familiar with the larger overall franchise. And Legacy is what ended up bringing lots of these people closer to the original Harry Potter and to the rest of the Wizarding franchise. The sudden massive surge in Harry Potter content we were seeing when it came out, and all the massive waves of support the game was suddenly getting all around from original fans, shows us Legacy was what got a lot of people really excited or really interested in this franchise again. And then on top of that, you have to consider it's almost a guarantee Legacy made fans out of people that didn't used to be fans of this franchise. People that either missed it when it was originally super popular or who just never got into it before the video game. Almost every adaptation brings in people like that. So all in all, you have a massive fan base that's either tied to this franchise because of Hogwarts Legacy, or that already followed the franchise and absolutely loves Legacy. So having Legacy be canon and even just making vague references to it in future projects wouldn't only please those fans, but it would actually give them a reason to stay invested in the rest of the Wizarding franchise. Again, I can just use myself as an example. Playing this game actually made me interested in this 20-something-year-old franchise again. Even if, to be perfectly honest, watching all those movies again or seeing all those new movies kind of reminded me of everything that made me lose interest in the first place. All the convoluted plot lines that are incredibly drawn out and incredibly over-dramatized, especially in those new movies. But you know what? I don't even care. This game actually got me so interested in this whole Wizarding world and this franchise again that I completely overlooked all that. It's the same with how there's been talk about how the next game might completely abandon the first game and start a whole new story. First off, I think it might be too soon to say for sure that's what they'll do. I mean, right now, all the developers actually said was that they want the next game to tie into the HBO series, but Cyberpunk 2077 ties into Cyberpunk 2020 and Cyberpunk Red, and yet story-wise, there's still 50 and 30 years between them. They don't necessarily have to start a whole new story or push the setting forward. Vague references that prove the two are connected are all you need to have a tie-in, even if the stories are 100 years apart. And personally, I'm really not too keen on this idea. I think there's a lot they could still do with the story of the first game. You're already playing as a Hogwarts student who just finished your 5th year in the first game. This could easily be a franchise where you import saves to the next game and keep going. But you know what? Even if they do this, I ultimately still wouldn't care. I enjoyed Legacy so much, I'd completely move past it and try out the next game. If the next game is anything like this game, I'm gonna give it a shot and I'm gonna want to play it. And again, from all the reactions this game's gotten, I'm clearly not the only person who feels this way. But another reason why I think Legacy should be canon is that on top of all this, there's really just no reason for it not to be canon. If nothing in the books contradicts Legacy, then why shouldn't it be canon? And if they're licensing it and making money off of it and it doesn't even affect anything in the original stories, then why shouldn't it be canon? I already gave my sort of overview on the whole idea of canon, and someone watching this might try and argue I got it wrong, but I maintain the only objective answer on what's canon and what's not is that whatever related material the creator or the owner of the source material says is canon, regardless if they wrote it themselves or not. Canon applies to a lot of different things. When it comes to writing, the idea of canon actually comes from people comparing religious texts. But even in just one religion, most of those texts were written by lots of different people at completely different points in time. And yet all those different books are considered canon in that one religion. And outside of just books, video games, comic books, movies, and TV shows also have canon behind them. But pretty much all these sorts of franchises bring in new or different writers for almost every single installment. This idea that only what was made by the original creator can be canon is very off base. And don't get me wrong, this is a franchise people feel very strongly about in all sorts of different ways, and people can obviously think whatever they want. If you personally don't want something to be canon, and you don't personally think of it as canon, who am I to tell you you should feel otherwise? And it's the same the other way around. I'm not saying you should consider something canon or not canon. I'm just saying if you're gonna try and argue Legacy should or shouldn't be canon, then there's no real reason it can't be canon. Because J.K. Rowling could decide tomorrow that this game is canon, and even if a lot of people don't think that it's canon, the rest of the franchise going forward would still treat it as canon. And unless Rowling or someone official outright tells us Legacy isn't canon, then right now there's no reason it can't be canon. Because again, Legacy is supposed to be set nearly 40 whole years before Fantastic Beasts and more than 100 years before Harry Potter. They wrote and kept the game's entire storyline as far away from the mainline franchise as they could so that it wouldn't contradict or even encroach on anything. And then on top of that, almost all the lore and all the world elements and even the fundamental elements of the story was taken straight out of the books and out of the screenplays. All the main elements of Hogwarts and Harry Potter and the Wizarding World are exactly the way they should be. And on top of that, everything about the way it portrays magic and almost all the different spells in this game are taken straight out of the books. Games like Legacy get a bad rap because they have to make the player character as powerful as possible. And a game like Bloodlines changed pretty much every discipline to make them look cooler for the video game. But except for Flipendo and some of the ancient magic abilities, even just the main character's spells and attacks in Legacy are pretty much exactly the way they're supposed to be according to the original books. Most of these were spells the main characters themselves used in the books, and all of them were either named and introduced in the books, or they were never named but they were still referenced or still showed up somehow in the books. And really, the spell casting and the combat in this game is almost exactly what you see in Fantastic Beasts. Characters go around spamming spells like Revelio or Reparo almost everywhere they go, and half of combat is blocking spells with Protego and even apparating back and forth to try and flank enemies. So really, even that minor aspect of Legacy is more in line with the mainline franchise than it might look. But even the actual story of Legacy itself is very much in line with the stories you see in the mainline franchise. It focuses on characters who are just trying to live their lives in the wizard world. Characters who all have their own problems to deal with or who are all just trying to get somewhere in day-to-day life. But while they're doing that, a major conflict with a massive conspiracy behind it suddenly breaks out and these characters end up becoming a big part of trying to stop it. And by going out and fighting against this conspiracy out in the real world, they end up finding the courage to face their own demons or to improve themselves and grow as people. And if this kind of coming-of-age story doesn't sound exactly like Harry Potter or Fantastic Beasts, then I don't know what does. Legacy fits in perfectly with the rest of the Wizarding franchise. Yeah, it's an action-adventure RPG game, and things like that final confrontation with Ranrock really reminds you of that. This obviously makes it feel a little different from the books, but even the screenplays for Fantastic Beasts had to be very different from the books because those were supposed to be movies. This is still a story-driven game, and in terms of the lore and the world building and the plot lines, the developers followed the books and the new movies as closely as they could. And in terms of the themes and the overarching ideas in the game's main story, the developers wrote this game by following the books and the new movies as closely as they could. And in terms of writing, games like these have a horrible reputation for being over the top and unbelievable, but really, with a franchise like Harry Potter, I would actually argue the plot to Hogwarts Legacy is pretty tame compared to the story of the originals. Someone might argue Legacy is just typical RPG nonsense because it's about a bunch of teenagers and mainly the player character taking on this entire goblin rebellion. But remember that the original Harry Potter was already all about one kid and his group of friends taking on this army of dark wizards that were threatening all of society. And they started at something like 11 years old. RPGs have this tendency to take the player character and turn them into some sort of paragon of humanity or someone who single-handedly saves the world. But if you stop and think about it, this specific franchise was pretty much already made for this kind of formula. The original books literally revolved around the Chosen One taking on what was supposed to be the biggest threat to humanity in wizard history. In the original stories, Voldemort and his army were 100 times more powerful and influential than anything you see in Legacy. And yet those stories had one kid consistently toppling these people for 7 years straight. And the way they had this happen got so convoluted, it makes the most contrived parts of Hogwarts Legacy look downright simple in comparison. And if it seems ridiculous that the main character in Legacy is this super advanced magical prodigy, well, that complaint really falls flat when this franchise already had characters like Dumbledore or Grindelwald or Voldemort or even Snape. Characters like this are hardly unexpected in this franchise. And having read the original 7 books, I really can't think of anything in the game that contradicts or goes against the mainline canon. Again, if you looked hard enough, I'm sure you'd find minor inconsistencies most people never noticed. But again, even the books and screenplays Rowling wrote herself have inconsistencies with each other. And if it doesn't affect the plot or the main ideas behind the franchise, then the events and the main ideas of the story itself are still consistent with the rest of the franchise and can still be canon. But on top of just not technically contradicting or going against anything, another reason why I think Legacy specifically fits in so well with the mainline canon is that its events are so far removed from the rest of the franchise that it never feels like anything in Legacy is intruding on mainline events. And this is where I want to bring up that other game I mentioned earlier just for comparison. The one that friend I mentioned introduced me to, the one that's very different from this game that I've actually been playing all the time now. Yeah, I was talking about the Hogwarts Mystery mobile game. Yeah, I know. Laugh all you want. Tell me if this sounds like the voice of someone who cares. But I guess to be fair, if you haven't played it yourself, comparing Legacy to something like Mystery probably sounds insane. And really, before I played Legacy and gave it a try myself, I probably would have laughed too if I'm being really honest. And someone who watches this and isn't laughing might say that sounds kinda shallow. But as someone who's put an ungodly number of hours into this game, I still say the majority of these kinds of mobile games in general are just god-awful. The ones that are remotely decent are usually ones that are tied to major game franchises and are actually trying to emulate the original games. But even then, the platform is so limited that there's only so much they can do with it. And the rest of the time, any mobile game that tries to be something more than just a casual game is always going to be the most painfully repetitive or basic game imaginable. And as much as I like it regardless, it's really no different with this game. This can't actually be the case, but it really feels like more than half the time I've spent playing it since October has just been mindlessly clicking the screen to get past the same 2 or 3 goddamn minigames again and again and again in every single quest just to get on with the actual game. But you know what? This is where the power of autism prevailed. Because if there's something even remotely interesting hidden underneath the garbage, I'll keep banging my head against the pointed stick as long as it takes just to see where it all goes. And like I said earlier, playing Legacy got me so invested in this franchise and this setting that I stuck it out. And you know what? When you get past the mind-numbing repetition, there's actually a surprisingly well-written storyline with surprisingly well-written characters and surprisingly compelling role-playing elements behind this game. And for that, despite its problems, I actually really like this game. You might find that hard to believe about a mobile game if you've never played it yourself, but probably 70% of this game is actually just reading what characters are saying or watching what they're doing. So really, the writing and the storylines are all this game is about. And on top of that, Mystery was published by the same Warner Brothers label that published Hogwarts Legacy. If you look up Portkey Games, Mystery and Legacy have actually been their most successful projects. And they were obviously developed by different people, but the games themselves actually reference things that only exist between the two games. Mystery references things that only ever show up in Legacy, and Legacy references things that only ever got shown or mentioned in Mystery. So whether you think games like Legacy can be canon to the overall franchise or not, it's pretty clear that Mystery and Legacy are actually supposed to be canon to each other at least. And when you really stop and think about it, the main story of Mystery actually has nearly the same exact premise as Hogwarts Legacy. The main ideas and the way it plays out are different, but the actual setup to the story is pretty much exactly the same as the one used for Legacy. Mystery is all about a player-made character who enrolls at Hogwarts before the time of Harry Potter. Most of the game revolves around completely original characters. And the premise is that back then, there were a bunch of secret vaults magically hidden in and around Hogwarts that most people thought were a myth, but a secret cabal of corrupt wizards knew that they existed and wanted to find them so that they could take whatever powerful magic was hidden inside them for themselves. The player character has an older brother who got mixed up with the cabal looking for the vaults and then disappeared. And they show up at Hogwarts for the first time and almost immediately start investigating what the Cabal is looking for and what the story behind the vaults really is. And along the way, they make a bunch of different friends who also get mixed up with the Cabal and help fight against them. And in doing this, they end up saving the school and the wizard community from a very dangerous conspiracy. And really, all of this is the same exact premise as Hogwarts Legacies. Both games actually use the same exact writing formula. They're both about kids who are completely new to Hogwarts who have personal connections to these huge secrets. And they both revolve around investigating these secret vaults almost no one knows anything about. And both of them have you doing this while you're fighting and investigating a group of bad guys who are also looking for the vaults and trying to stop them from taking them for themselves. So as different as Hogwarts Mystery might be as a game, Legacy actually ended up borrowing a lot from this game 5 years later. But at the same time, the writing in Hogwarts Mystery is also about as different from Hogwarts Legacy as you can get. Because while the writers behind Legacy try and stay out of the original's way, the writers behind Mystery lean against the mainline events of Harry Potter like it owes them money or something. This story is supposed to take place 7 years before Harry Potter and his friends end up going to school there. And because of that, any mainline Harry Potter character they could find a way to fit into this game makes a cameo or plays some sort of role in its story. Most of these roles are pretty small, and most of the focus is on the original characters, but characters like Dumbledore and McGonagall and Snape regularly show up and take part in the story. And this is supposed to be a time where most of the teachers from the books are already teaching, and a lot of the older side characters in the books are still students. So almost all the main characters' teachers are supposed to be Harry Potter's teachers from the books. A lot of the main characters' friends are supposed to be the side characters that become friends with Harry Potter during the books. And the main character and their friends happen to get into all sorts of crazy adventures with tons of characters who are major figures in the fight against Voldemort in the actual series. So Legacy is this giant groundbreaking story, but it's supposed to have happened so long ago that it really doesn't have any ties to the main events of the franchise aside from the fact that they take place in the same universe. Mystery, on the other hand, is also this huge and epic story that's supposed to impact all of Hogwarts, but it involves so many of the mainline characters and takes place so close to the mainline stories that it really feels like it's trying to hover over or force itself side by side with the books and the movies. With Mystery, you'd have to believe all these extraordinary events happen one after another to the same group of people. Right after an entire war with Voldemort, 7 years of Mystery threatens all of Hogwarts, and then immediately after that, 7 more years of the Harry Potter Chronicles threatens all of Hogwarts all over again. And all these characters that help Harry Potter all took part in this whole other adventure where they all took on another giant wizard conspiracy right before taking on Voldemort and the Death Eater conspiracy. So if we're gonna argue about what deserves to be canon, the writers behind Hogwarts Legacy did everything they could to make sure nothing in it felt like it intruded on the mainline events of the franchise in any way. And once again, all this also goes to show there's really no reason why Legacy can't be canon. But there's one more reason I'd argue Legacy should be canon, and that's that Legacy actually did exactly what Fantastic Beasts did by finally telling a completely new and original story that also tried to appeal to both younger and older fans. Those movies might have been hit and miss, or in my opinion, just not very good, but the stories they were telling were at least new by trying to move away from stuff that everyone already knows. And at the same time, they at least tried to be more relatable to the older fans who, in this franchise, are now a considerable, if not the majority, of fans. And Hogwarts Legacy not only does this, but it actually does it better, because it managed to do exactly what Star Wars was doing from the beginning. Harry Potter has always been a lot like Star Wars, but unlike Star Wars, the original material always had a very, very narrow target audience. Star Wars is a very good example of a franchise that purposefully appealed to all sorts of people. And you might not believe that, but it's true. I always laugh a little when I hear Star Wars is just for kids, because to me that was one of the biggest marketing schemes in all of media. It's easier to get young kids to like things made for older fans than to do the opposite. And older fans will watch whatever they want, while parents only take kids to see things you say were made for kids. But if you look at the writing in every Star Wars movie except one, it was actually all geared towards teenagers and very young adults. Every single movie except one revolves completely around 19 or 20-year-olds entering adulthood, leaving home, and going out into the real world for the first time. And I'm not saying this isn't also for kids, because it is, but it's clearly also for people who'd identify with those issues in real life. You can be pretentious and narrow-minded and say they're movies with space wizards and laser swords, but that's like saying Game of Thrones is a show with sword fights and dragons. You'd say, but the sex and violence makes it an adult show, but then this focus on entering adulthood can also make Star Wars a franchise for young adults. And if you still don't believe it, or you just want to ignore all that, then just look at the very first movie. Not the prequels, not anything that comes later. There are tons of archived news shots of people lining up for blocks and blocks to see the very first movie in 1977. And even from the beginning, the overwhelming majority of the people you see in those pictures or those videos were not young kids. Even from the beginning, it's clear a very sizable portion, if not most of the audience, were already in their teens to their 20s. And that shouldn't be surprising, because sci-fi and fantasy aren't exclusively for young kids. And even with the space magic and the laser swords, the fact that these were live-action movies that weren't afraid to touch on some fairly serious topics whenever they wanted was clearly enough to appeal to older kids and older fans. It's just that they also presented all this and made all this as kid-friendly as possible, and they made sure it also appealed to younger kids. And really, stories that revolve around teenagers or young adults are stories that have the best of both worlds, because these can appeal to just about everyone. They're not bogged down by any sort of dialogue or any thought processes you might try to take on when the characters are young kids. So it's much more believable that these characters would be three-dimensional and intelligent enough to carry more complicated stories. And young kids can always find the more fantastical or exciting sides of the stories they can enjoy, while people who are actually that age in real life have characters they can personally identify with. But people who are even older can still relate to these characters who remind them of themselves or things they've gone through when they were younger, because the characters are at least conscious and mature enough for them to identify with on some basic level. And really, this is one of the things I think Legacy did with Harry Potter. With Harry Potter, the original books and movies were pretty exclusively geared towards young kids, and I think you'd have a hard time debating that. The stories mostly featured young kids. For most of the franchise, the main focus of the stories was on young kids in school who just happened to be dealing with extraordinary problems. And unlike Star Wars, Harry Potter has also mostly been pretty stagnant for a long time. Most of what they were putting out was usually just adaptations of the same exact stories. And the problem is that all this leaves the franchise a bit deadlocked, because their fans are either kids who've just gotten into Harry Potter now, when it's way past its peak popularity and there are a lot more popular franchises, or they're people who liked Harry Potter as kids and still follow it now. And no matter which group you're talking about, nothing you do with the same stories again and again will ever generate as much excitement and success as something new. But at the same time, nothing new they've been putting out has really had that much of an impact except Legacy and Fantastic Beasts. There have been new stories like The Cursed Child or Hogwarts Mystery, but aside from the fact that neither of these were delivered in a way most of the audience could take seriously, both of these were still stories that revolved around the same area and the same characters in the franchise. And even among fans, none of these things ever got the kind of traction Hogwarts Legacy did. And Legacy does something completely new while also doing exactly what Star Wars did by telling a kind of story that's much more relatable to older and younger fans. Fantastic Beasts tried to do this by focusing their new stories on a character who's older and who actually has a career and an adult life. I think part of the reason J.K. Rowling did that is because that's where a lot of the original fans actually were in their own lives by that point. But one of the many problems with that series is that they did that by removing a lot of the things people loved about the originals. But Legacy, on the other hand, takes the story right back to Hogwarts, but then it goes in a completely new direction with it. And on top of that, it immediately focuses the story on characters who are already 15 or 16. So right there, these characters are a lot easier for older fans to identify with. And they're actually supposed to be mature enough from the start that the game can explore Harry Potter in a much grittier and more grounded way than we ever got in the originals. Because of this, the game very often dives into some pretty complicated or questionable situations or into some very nuanced human problems that just never would have made sense if the main cast was 11 or 12. So doing this really let Legacy have the best of both worlds. But more importantly, it actually let them take the entire Harry Potter formula in a very new direction. So having Legacy be canon would only encourage more content like this. It would only make it easier for writers and creators to continue telling stories like this in the future and to take the rest of the franchise in new directions like this in the future. But all in all, I think that pretty much wraps everything up. I've been looking at a lot of Hogwarts Legacy stuff, and I've seen a lot of these debates about how it's supposed to fit in with the rest of the franchise, so these are just my thoughts on Hogwarts Legacy and canon. To sum it all up, I maintain that overall, canon is just whatever's accepted as a valid part of a larger body of works, but this can mean that a bunch of different stories that have nothing to do with each other were all written by the same person, or it can mean that a bunch of different stories are all tied into one another and they're all supposed to take place in the same fictional universe as each other, even if they were written by different people. Either way, you're describing stories that all fit into one collection. But there's this idea that canon only means what was written by the original creator, and really that definition is completely incorrect. Canon applies to more things than just regular books. Religious texts have canon to them, but even in one religion, most of those texts were written by completely different people at completely different points in time. Comic books, video games, movies, and TV shows also have canon to them, and pretty much none of these ever have the same writers behind them. But when it comes to whether Hogwarts Legacy is canon to the rest of this franchise, we really just don't know yet. The only one who can decide if it's canon or not is J.K. Rowling, and she hasn't given any indication one way or the other. So really, all we have are arguments for why Hogwarts Legacy should or shouldn't be canon. And personally, I think there are a lot of reasons why it should be canon. But you know what? Don't get me wrong here. All of this is just what I think, or me giving my sort of overview on all this, and if anyone watches this, I really don't want to sound full of myself. Because looking at a lot of these different comments and a lot of these different arguments, I've seen a bunch of people who are incredibly pretentious and incredibly conceited about this kind of stuff. People who are diehard fans of the books, or who are pretending like they're diehard fans of the books, doing everything they can to try to talk down to and belittle fans of the video game. These unintelligent narcissists who tell people the game is glorified fanfiction and then pretend that somehow liking it or that people who like it are beneath them somehow. Meanwhile, they act like reading the books about a bunch of magic kids at a magic school instead is an actual life accomplishment. And this was the same insufferable nonsense you used to see whenever you looked up The Witcher after people started reading the books because the Netflix show came out. The Witcher games were what brought that franchise actual global success. They were so successful they finally got people outside Europe into The Witcher. The Witcher 3 particularly was so successful, even people in countries like China or Japan were falling in love with The Witcher, and this was why they made the Netflix series in the first place. But as soon as people found out there were books behind the franchise, you immediately started seeing the same shameless frauds you always see looking for any excuse to pat themselves on the back, saying the same exact things. Doing everything they could to rub it in people's faces that the games were just glorified fanfiction so they could try and act as if liking them or the people who played them were somehow beneath them. And what was so ridiculous with The Witcher was that you know a lot of these people who were saying and writing these things in perfect English were probably lying. The Witcher books were written in Polish all the way back in the 90s, but they never translated them to English until the first game came out almost 20 years later, and even then there was very little demand for them with English reading audiences. They only did the first two and left the rest of them untranslated for years. We only saw more and more people reading the English versions after the games got more and more popular, and then again later when the Netflix show came out. So most of these people who cared enough to talk about the games in the first place but didn't know how to read Polish or Russian or German only read the books because they enjoyed the games. Or they watched the Netflix series and then read the books because they enjoyed the games. But out of nowhere, because Witcher was suddenly mainstream and they wanted to pretend like they were more cultured or like they were a part of the real Witcher, they suddenly didn't like the games anymore. Or worse, they never even played the games and didn't know anything about them, but still wanted to go around telling people they were bad because they watched a Netflix show and just started reading the books. And don't get me wrong, I like the games and the books, but if you legitimately just didn't like what the games did with the story, that's perfectly fine. And with The Witcher, we know the games weren't canon. The author outright said he didn't consider the games canon and that only the books he wrote were a part of the original story. But the people who did all this still just show how incredibly pathetic and laughable this whole mentality really is. Even just saying those games were bad because they're just fan fiction out of some petty spitefulness actually shows how pretentious and shallow these people were. Because yeah, those games weren't canon. But are we really ignoring the fact that the author of the books sold the rights to make them, that he made money off of them, and he told the developers what they could do with them? A lot of people might not know that, but when they started making and writing those games, Sapkowski actually sat down with them and laid out what they could do with his material. He told them Geralt was still alive and that they were allowed to bring him back as the main character in the first place. So first off, even though they're not canon, there are clearly major differences between an adaptation and fan fiction you or I could write all by ourselves. But more importantly, how do the games not being canon make them any less enjoyable? But because people like this are so stunted and so childish and so desperate to pretend they're better than other people, some of them will blatantly make things up. They'll pretend we shouldn't like something because it's somehow less than, as if liking it would make them less cultured or less valid. Like we're all still in the 5th grade and we still have to pretend we like the right things to try and be cool. Meanwhile, this whole superiority complex revolves around the fact that they like the books while other people like video games about a guy who fights monsters and has sex with witches. About the same exact thing, just done in a different way. So even though I made a lot of different arguments about a lot of different things, I really don't want to sound conceited about this kind of stuff. Really, we're still talking about fiction. All of this is still just make-believe, and at the end of the day, this is all just there to entertain people. This franchise is a big deal to a lot of people, so if you feel strongly about this and you don't agree with something I said, well, who am I to tell you to feel or think different? And if you think I got something completely wrong, or if there's something I don't know or just didn't talk about, then go ahead and tell me down in the comments. I'd love to hear what anyone else thinks about this sort of stuff. Big thanks to anyone watching, as always, and take care.